And this week I'm delighted to be joined by a titan of the Conservative Party, Mark Francois. He was elected as the MP for Rayleigh and Wickford in 2001. After serving in the Territorial Army and building a career in banking and consulting, Mark brought a tough, no-holds-barred attitude to Westminster, campaigning relentlessly against the growing bureaucracy of the European Union. Mark was one of the 28 so-called Spartans who rejected Theresa May's Brexit deal 3 times in the Commons. Now, chair of the European Research Group, Mark continues to campaign for a true Brexit, which honours the result of the 2016 referendum. I'm pleased to say that Mark is here in the studio with me now. Mark, thank you very much for joining me.
Donna, thank you for having me on.
Well, I've read a lot of things about you. I'm looking forward to finding out more about your book as well.
Thank you.
But you were doing things in the city. What kind of stuff were you doing before you got into politics? Because there is often the criticism of politicians that they don't know anything about the real world.
Well, my first ever job was as a paper boy on the council estate that I grew up on in Basildon, so that's how I got to know it well. And then I went off to university after being at what you might call a bog standard comprehensive. And I read history at Bristol. I read an MA in war studies, sort of military history at King's under a chap called Professor Lawrence Freedman, who was a very well-known academic. First job was in the city working for a bank. Then I moved into
What did you do at the bank? Were you one of those traders type thing?
No, I wasn't. No, I wasn't an investment. No, I was purely a graduate trainee, but it was probably a bit too regimented for me. So actually, I moved into sort of PR, public affairs, public relations, and I found that was my niche. And I worked for a consulting firm. Then I went self-employed. So I actually ran my own business.
So you've done quite a bit. What kind of business was it?
Well, I was a consultant. And, you know, so I've sat there at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, filling in a VAT return. I remember what that's like. I remember what it's like to run your own business. It's very exhilarating, but it's also incredibly hard work.
It's tough. You get a day off.
Yeah. And also I spent about 7 years in the Territorial Army. This is during the Cold War.
What was that like?
Well, I was an infantry officer, so to be clear, I never did active service. I never went to Iraq or Afghanistan. I've got no medals and not entitled to any. But we trained for one scenario, which was World War III, because when I was in, the Berlin Wall was still up. And so at my battalion, 5 Royal Anglian, as was, in the event of the balloon going up, our job was to go to West Germany and defend a bridge in the regular army's rear area. So mercifully, the wall came down. Margaret Thatcher, Ronnie Reagan won the Cold War, and Eastern Europe became free. But now, unfortunately, with Putin, to some degree, history is repeating itself.
It seems interesting that we almost haven't learnt the lessons, and we seem to be back there again.
Well, my father, one of the reasons I got into politics, my dad was a D-Day veteran. I've got all his naval papers at home. Unfortunately, he died when I was 14. But he taught me, as a young boy, never to take living in a free country for granted. And that's something that kind of I tried to remember all my political life. And one of the reasons I think I got so involved in the whole Brexit debate was I thought that was about living in a free country. And we had a referendum. And you may recall they put a booklet through everyone's door before it saying, this is your decision. The government will implement what you decide. And people voted peacefully and democratically to leave. And then the government didn't really implement it.
That was an interesting time, that I remember watching all of that. It was, to be honest, watching all of that was quite embarrassing, because it was people stopping the democratic vote from having every tactic they could possibly employ to circumnavigate a democratic vote was employed at that stage.
Yeah, I mean,
it was embarrassing. I mean, in the rest of the world were watching, and they were laughing at us. I can remember hearing this one guy saying, "Oh, there's no need to put on any Netflix movies for comedy. We might as well just watch the British MPs." And it was all of you. It wasn't just like one party. It was all of them just making an embarrassment.
It was 3 years of trench warfare.
Oh, it's terrible.
Because the establishment, aided by some, fellow travellers in Parliament, did everything they could to try and frustrate the democratic result. I took the liberty of writing a book called Spartan Victory about how we won in the end. Still available on Amazon, if I might cheekily say. But this is the story of how we finally managed to deliver Brexit in the face of all of that opposition. And it's a battle that we had to fight, because if we hadn't have done, the risk was that people, whatever their normal political allegiance, would just lose faith in the democratic process itself. Because if you're going to have a referendum and the people decide, and you don't then implement their decision, people would have started to say, well, what's the point of voting in elections?
Well, that is the worry, isn't it? Because, you see a lot of people not happy with decisions that are made and thinking, well, we're not going to follow it and we can't go down that path, because if you start that path, then there's literally no point in politics at all.
Well, look, no one likes it if you're a Tory seeing the government, criticised very heavily, but we live in a country where you can do that. Yeah. And again, at the risk of repeating, my father told me never to take that for granted. If you're in China and you criticise the government, even online, at 3 o'clock in the morning you may disappear and never be seen again. So we should never take for granted the fact that we can disagree democratically and peacefully. We can criticise the government of the day, and ultimately, in a general election, we can replace them with someone else if that's what the people decide to do.
Well, you talked about Brexit. How successful do you think it's sort of been, looking at it now? I mean, do you feel it's done?
We did it. We left. We legally left the institutions of the European Union. We withdrew our MEPs from the European Parliament because we were no longer entitled to them. So we left. I do believe it's been a success. We had the fastest vaccine rollout, arguably in Europe, arguably in the world.
Was that really because we were outside the EU, though? Was that really why? What was the thing that made it that we didn't have to go via the EU? What was it that
we didn't have to go via the European Medicines Agency. Right. We were able, as it were, to row our own canoe. The first ever jab that was in Britain. So I think that's one example. We've now managed to sign all of these new trade deals with Australia, with New Zealand, over 70 of them. This very exciting one with Trans-Pacific countries. That could open up £11 billion worth of markets. So I do think it's been a success. But having COVID happen right in the middle of that
was tough. Clearly
has made that more difficult than it otherwise would have been, and I think it would be silly not to recognise that.
And what does a good Brexit deal look like to you? You'd say a good one, what is it?
Well, it gives us an ability to trade with other countries around the world as we see fit. When you were in the European Union, you couldn't do a trade deal with anyone else. You could only do it via the institutions of the EU. Now, we've entered this massive trade deal with the Trans-Pacific countries. We've got them with Australia, we've got them with New Zealand. I hope at some point we will sign a major trade deal with the United States and with other major powers as well. But the point is, we now have the power to do that. It's our decision, it's Parliament's decision. We're not beholden to the EU if we want to do that. This is all about running our own country. The thing I've never really understood, Nana, I know I've debated this for years, the thing I've never really got my head round is why some people in this country were so opposed to us running our own country and wanted us to be run by someone else instead.
I agree with that, although having seen the way things are going, sometimes I ask myself why. This is Mark Francois. It's such a pleasure for you to come and talk to me. I look forward to us speaking outside Purdah, where we can
and there's some bedtime reading for you.
Oh, Spartan Victory. Lovely. And this is all about our battle for Brexit. It is the inside story. Mark Francois, thank you so much. Lovely to talk to you.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much.